Great. Well, welcome everybody to this presentation this evening. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce to you Dr. Alessandra Batty, who holds a degree and a postgraduate degree with specialization in classical archaeology from the Università di Roma La Sapienza in Rome, and an MA in archaeology and a PhD in history of art from the University of Manchester in the UK. She has lectured on Greek and Roman art and architecture for more than 10 years at the University of Manchester, and is currently also affiliated to my department at the University of Bonn. Alessandra's main research interests are architectural analysis and its implications, and we will hear a lot, I think, about that today. And she's also very interested in her research in the history of archaeological studies. Currently, she is engaged in a multidisciplinary project with Liverpool Hope University on the perception of late antique architectural features. And among her publications is her PhD dissertation, which was published as a monograph with BAR in 2018. This is about the Domus del Ninfeo at Ostia, about which we'll also be hearing today. And her English translation of Giuseppe Marti's book on Herculaneum will also be published soon. Today, she will talk about tracking dependency in late antique Roman domestic architecture, the example of the Domus del Ninfeo at Ostia. Alessandra, the stage is open for you.
Thank you very much for this very warm introduction, Professor Hegewald. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the Bonn Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies and Jan for coordinating and helping in the setup of this meeting. And of course, thank you all very much for being here, and I hope that today this meeting will be of some interest. So, tracking dependency in late antique Roman domestic architecture, the example of the Domus del Ninfeo at Ostia. Now, before going directly into the topic of the meeting, I would like to start with very, very general points about slavery in Roman society. And you will forgive me because I imagine that all these points are very well known to you. And you will also forgive me for the generalization, but I just want to put a context around the meeting today. So, Roman society was heavily reliant on slavery. This is something that we know very, very well. But what did it mean to actually be a slave? Was it a process or a state of being? How did you become one? Did you undertake a process from freedom to slavery? Or were you just inherently a slave? Of course, both situations were actually possible. You could be free and then become a slave. You could become captive. You could be abandoned and then rescued, but then sold into slavery. Or you could fall prey of bandits or pirates. Or you can enter into a sort of self-enslavement contract. By the law, you couldn't sell yourself, for example, to repay a debt, but you could go around the law in some sort of a way to actually contract yourself for a payment. Slavery was also considered a possibility as a punishment for hideous crimes, though we do not know the extent to which this kind of measure was applied. And these are all examples of free people who would enter into the state of slavery. But you could also be born a slave. So you could be a slave from the very beginning. And what would be your identity? And here, once again, generalizing, you would be part of an extended family that Latin sources generally called a domus. And here I'm not going to use the term domus simply because later I will be using it for an architectural structure, so I don't want to make a confusion. I will just call it a family. You will be part of an extended family along with a master who owns you, with this immediate family, with other slaves, and also slaves that in time had been freed by the master. So we are talking about a large nucleus. But you wouldn't have the proper name that would characterize, for example, Roman citizens. You wouldn't be able to marry, although then the possibility of entering into some sort of contract was allowed by the law. You wouldn't be able to own a property. You would be able to manage the property of your master, but you wouldn't be able to have your own. To sum it all up, you would be a property, you yourself. It is what Varro in 1st century BC would call you a speaking tool, an instrumentum vocale. This is just to give a very rough idea. And of course, also the slave situation would actually change. We generally make a rough distinction between slaves who lived in the town, slaves who lived in the countryside. The slaves who lived in the town, we think that they were more autonomous. They were often entrusted by the masters to manage their business interests, like the shops. In a way, those who lived in the town probably experienced the dimension of the family in a much more close way than those in the countryside. In a way, they shared, of course, from very different positions, but in a way, they actually shared the life of the master. Whilst in the countryside, the situation could be extremely rough, not only because of the type of labor that was very intensive, but also because in some contexts, in a farm or a countryside, slaves could be counted in the hundreds. So you could become actually part of a productive system that would be completely alien from you. You would be a number. This wouldn't always happen, but it could actually happen. So that's why we make this distinction between the slave in the household, living in the household, and generally living in the town, and the slave of the countryside. And these are these are 3 fragments of frescoes from the very Domus del Ninfeo that actually depict works on the countryside. But wherever they were, really the life condition of the slave, whether he lived in a town, whether he lived in a house or in the countryside, this life condition really depended on the master's inclination. Roman society worked towards the possibility of actually normalizing the life of the slave through a process called the manumissio. And through the manumissio, the slave would actually be able to earn his own freedom, not only his own passive freedom from the owner, but also an active freedom, including, for example, the right to vote, of course, with some specific limitation. But let us say that for as long as the slave was under the master, and the slave was not the master of his own destiny. So one of his main objectives was to acquire this particular freedom, to be free of managing his own life. This could happen through manumissio, and there were also, legally speaking, there were various types of manumissio. Of course, a slave could also decide to actually take matters in his own hands and not waiting for a kind master to decide whether he would be free. He could actually try to find his own luck. And probably it is not a coincidence that the slavery object that we are mostly accustomed to is the slave collar. This is an example from Ostia with a very simple inscription, Tene me fugiam fugio, hold me so that I cannot run away, because I am running away. And probably the most famous is this that we call the Toninus collar with the inscription, I ran away, hold me. When you bring me back to my master Toninus, you will get a gold coin. And this is because the undisciplined slave could actually would be branded by its owner. The slave was a property in itself. The slave had a value. So a slave that flees the master's house is a part of your property that you're actually losing. But the subtext of my talk today is twofold. And on one side, it relates to the invisibility of the slaves. And on the other side, it relates to the anxiety of the high classes towards the slaves themselves. And these two themes, the themes of invisibility and the theme of anxiety, are actually intertwined. I'll try just saying a few words to show how, but most of all, then my objective is to show how the invisibility of the slaves was actually pursued in the Domus del Ninfeo at Ostia. Now, when we look at Roman law, and by no means I am not an expert on Roman law, but when we look at it, we say that slaves are actually ubiquitous in them. And this probably betrays the difficulty in treating a subject that presented many, many challenges. And this is because the high classes were absolutely aware that slaves were not the speaking tools that the masters would have liked them to be. Another element that comes from a survey of Roman law is that laws regulating slave treatment, they become more and more, I would say, lenient. They become lighter passing times. Why is it that? Some historians like Carco Pinot have been talking about the enlightenment of the ruling classes that become more aware about humanitarian concerns. But it's actually possible that there was some collective anxiety also at the root of this. The high class was very well aware that the slaves would have a burden of resentment, a bitterness of hatred towards their masters. And so we see, as I said, the laws at some point start permitting the slaves to actually enter into a binding contract like that of marriage. At some point, slaves could not be sold anymore by the masters for gladiatorial games. Under the Emperor Claudius, for example, the slave that turns sick should not be abandoned by the master, because if he's abandoned by the master and if he actually happens to recover his health, then he also regains his freedom. So there is a system in place that actually goes in favor of the slave. When we look at the everyday situation, we have an awareness, or some sources have an awareness that it was the behavior of the master that could actually play on the slave. When Seneca says the slaves are not enemies when we acquire them, because we make them enemies. So the moment in which we say as many enemies as you have slaves, well, that is something that is really dependent on us. So with Seneca, we look at kindness as a sort of an everyday system, a mechanism control. Another control mechanism, once again kindness, is explored by Pliny the Younger. But with Pliny the Younger, we say that kindness may not be enough. And in fact, Pliny says, nor is it possible for anyone to be safe just because he's lenient and kind. For it is not by rational calculation that masters are murdered, but by viciousness. And Pliny here is commenting about a master that has been actually killed by the slaves. And here the position, once again, is the position of Seneca. Yes, you have to be kind, but even when you are kind, you cannot be absolutely sure. Then you look at Columella in the 1st century AD, and he doesn't only talk about kindness, he also talks about inclusivity as a control mechanism. And he explains pretty well and make it a practice to call the slaves into consultation as if they were more experienced. Of course, they were not. To discover by this means what kind of ability they have. And I observe that they are more willing to set about a piece of work on which they think their opinion have been asked and their advice have been followed. But then, of course, the strongest form of control mechanism is the manumission, because the prospect of freedom might encourage the slave to be obedient and to be hard-working. So all these mechanisms, whether they are on the side of the law, so they are official kind of mechanisms, whether they are actually enacted by the master himself, all these mechanisms were at play because the master, of course, needed to seek obedience and work from the slave, but also because the master was well aware that the slaves always interacted. Whether they worked in a rural estate or in the house, they could form bonds of solidarity, bonds of friendship. That would be not bad in itself, but the anxiety that the slaves could actually cooperate to the detriment of the master was always at play. One point about the invisibility, and I would really like to touch very quickly on that, relates on the matter of the garment, because we said that the slave doesn't have the 3 names of the master, but we also know from literary sources that the slaves and the free were not always very easy to recognize on a day-to-day basis. And here there are just a couple of sources. One is Seneca, and the other is the Historia Augusta about Alexander Severus. And in Seneca, there is this proposal that was once made in the Senate to distinguish the slaves from the free men by the dress. And it was discovered how dangerous it would be for our slaves to be able to count our own numbers. So you would think that at the time of Nero, the problem was actually dealt with and then it was, let's say, put at rest. But that was not the case, because he came back with Alexander Severus. And it was his intention to assign a peculiar type of clothing to each imperial staff, not only to the various ranks, but also to the slaves as a class, that they might be easily recognized when among the populace and held in check in case of disorder, and also that they may be prevented from mingling with the freeborn. And this separation between the classes is something that is really foundational when, and I just picked one example, but when you read the account of Dionysius of Halicarnassus about Romulus, and he talks about the foundation of Rome, and he talks about Romulus who divided all the people in 3 groups, and then he distinguished those who were eminent for their birth from the other ones, then you understand that the class separation is something that may well have been refined, but is something that is considered pivotal and foundational from the very beginning. But then if the slave, if it was not always possible to distinguish the slave from the free in the public forum, then what would happen when you would go into the private sphere? Because the majority of families, they did own the slaves. And slaves could have been employed in the house or displaced somewhere else, for example, to look after the master's interest. In the case of a house, how is this distinction maintained? Are we actually able to distinguish between the master's part of the house, the slave part of the house? Well, this doesn't happen very often, and actually I would say it doesn't happen as often as we would like. We have a lot of problems, of course, in identifying rooms, because rooms in Roman houses, probably they were more multifunctional than our rooms. Of course, we don't always have furniture. Sometimes the house is relatively small, so when you have a small area, then it really becomes almost impossible to actually trace any kind of distinction. Now, the example of the Domus del Ninfeo is interesting, in my opinion, because it shows that as soon as here there was the possibility of drawing a line between one social class and the other, they actually did it. Now, this is a plan of the town of Ostia, just outside Rome. And here, highlighted in red, you see the Domus del Ninfeo, which actually lies on the westernmost part of the town. This big road that you see in front of it, this is all the main east-west road of Ostia, the Decumanus Maximus. If we actually close up into here, we see this is still the Domus del Ninfeo, and you have the Decumanus in front. And you also have to imagine that here, at least in the beginning, in the 2nd century AD, here there was also a road. This map encompasses 2nd century and late antique structures just all together. But let's say that there was a road here and the road here. This is an aerial view of this very large house. And as Professor Hegewald was saying, this was the subject of my PhD. So I had the fun of actually spending 3 solid years among these walls. And you have to imagine that when this structure was first built, it was built in the shape of an insula. So it's a multi-story complex that may have had shops on the ground floor or apartments, and then a series of apartments on the upper floors. The Domus del Ninfeo probably had 3 upper floors. This is another restitution of another kind of insula, where on the ground floor you wouldn't have shops, you would have apartments. But whatever the basic layout, let's say that on the ground floor you would have either shops or apartments, and on the upper floors you would have apartments. And the whole, this, let's say, just to give you a brief run inside the house. Today you can enter the house, let's say from here, also from other sides. But let's say that I will show you some pictures, just starting from here. So starting from one of the main entrances during late antiquity, just to give you an impression. So that is the main entrance from the side alley, and you would see these are all late antiquity modifications superimposed on a 2nd century structure. So what you can see is mainly 3rd/4th century modifications on the insula. But anyway, you would enter from here. This is another view from this side. and you would see this area D, which is this one here with this lovely fountain. This is the Ninfeo. The Ninfeum, of course, is a fountain. This is the Ninfeo that gives the name to the house. This probably you can see it better from here, and you can also see this this area here that I called corridor R, and we will come back to this later. You'll see the entrance to room E, which is probably the most important room of the house, which is here. And you can also have a glimpse of this semicircular room U that you have down here, probably able to host a stibadium. This is another view, and this time from this tiny room B into this room C here, where you have only one column standing, the other has been stolen, and then you can see still the courtyard. Just looking at a different perspective, here you have some of the shops at the front, this shops here in particular. As you can see, the structure is only extant on the ground floor, as for probably 99.9% structures at Ostia. If we actually flip our viewpoint from here and we look inside here, this is what remains. This corridor here is this one here. So you have a glimpse of room P. A better glimpse might be this one here, where you also see these two partitions here. They are actually this ones here. And this is a view from the Decumanus Maximus, so from the main road with all the shops. The Domus del Ninfeo is this structure on the left-hand side. So this is the plan of the house. And when we think about the 2nd century structure, we can actually conceptualizing as being divided into 3 ranges. A shop range at the front, in front of the Decumanus Maximus, an apartments range here in the middle, and then something very uncommon, very peculiar. We have an open area range here at the back. To look at these 2 rooms because they did not exist. An open area range here at the back, sort of gardens, common gardens, that would be accessible by anybody living in the complex itself. But then we can also conceptualize this structure as divided into blocks. And so we distinguish between one red block here, which centers around this tiny apartment, O and P. Q didn't exist in the 2nd century. And this other larger blue apartment, which would be K, R, E, S, T, U, V. And K would actually be limited to here. Now, I will come back, of course, to this, but just to say that I identified 4 phases in the life of this monument: the pre-Adrianic, the Adrianic or insular phase, an intermediate phase, and the late antique or Domus phase. But of course, these are no more than umbrella terms to actually group a number of interventions, at times correlated, at times not correlated, that are telling of the complexity of the building's life. And today I would just like to point our attention on the Adrianic and the late antique. So I won't talk about pre-Adrianic, and I will not talk about the intermediate. Let us look in particular at the apartments. Let us start with this blue apartment. This is in the 2nd century AD. This apartment is what we would call a medianum kind of apartment. And the medianum was an elongated room, which would be a sort of a multifunctional kind of room, generally flanked by two other big rooms, and that gave access to other smaller rooms. As I said, what you can see here is actually late antique. The 2nd century plan must have looked much more like this. You would have had the Medianum, you would have the 2 rooms on both sides, and as you can see, you would have other rooms here at the back. And notice the circulation, the possibility of circulation between all these rooms. So it's quite an open kind of plan, and it is a fluidity that I will just recall later. And this is what we have then in the blue sector, a large apartment with a medianum, 2 flanking rooms and a number of smaller rooms. But what do we have in the red area? We have a very small place that was originally articulated just in 2 rooms, O and P, because Q was created in late antiquity. And this place was actually pretty small, so small that at some point, but actually pretty soon in the life of this complex, the owner of this apartment decided to actually buy the small open area that was facing it and decided to convert it. This is something that has been found out during the PhD, and it was not known before. So basically, he bought the garden, let's say, and he built some rooms, clearly because he didn't have much space or enough space for his own needs. And he builds a couple of rooms with mosaics. Here you see we have a well and we have an area with spicatum. I'm just going to show you some pictures. This is one of the mosaic. This is the well, of course, with part of a mosaic on one side. And this is a Roman, not an ancient one, but one that is actually attending at the clearance of one of the rooms. So during the 2nd century, we have this 2 apartments, one small one and a big one. But what happens during late antiquity? In late antiquity, we come to a completely different situation because one person, clearly a very wealthy one, actually arrives and buys the whole complex. And after that, it starts not a simple refurbishment, but a complete renovation of the whole property. All positive changes, let's call them like this, they all take place in the former blue apartment sector. So what happens? It starts building new rooms, and new rooms have features like columns. Okay, they are second-hand columns, but nevertheless, they are visually imposing elements. Here in front, you have an area that is actually paved with marble. You can see it probably more clearly here. Here there is also another very small decorative fountain that has been found during the PhD, and this one here. And then these rooms are paved with opus sectile, so they are paved with colored marbles. This is one example. In this room, there is not so much of it. This is, of course, the Ninfeo, also dating from the late antique period, from 3rd century onwards. That is in the courtyard of the house. And then you have the marvelous sectile of room E, with this Solomon's knot, with this emblemata. Very well preserved, as you can see. This is a view of room E, so you can see the trifora, you can see the sectile. And this is the view from different viewpoints, and you can see also the Ninfeo that the owner would have enjoyed the view on. And you can see that marble is not only on the floor, but was also on the walls, riveted the walls up to a certain height. And then on another side of the house, there were also these frescoes, the frescoes that detail the farming activities. Clearly, the owner must have been a landowner. But this is what happened on this side of the house. What happens on this other side of the house? Well, if you ask me for some positive change, then I will tell you that there are no positive changes down here. Unless you want to classify as a positive change, actually the opening, this big opening from this little room Q to this area A. We have seen that area A during the 2nd century becomes populated, let's say, with rooms. Now everything is actually dismantled, the rooms are completely raised. So we go back to a flat, let's say, situation. We have the pavements surviving, but no more than that. We have basins in here, but look at this kind of basins. They're all working basins, extremely rough. That's one. This is the other. On another side, we have 3 altogether and possibly other 2. So area A from a tiny garden then becomes a working area. And what interested me was also the way in which the internal connectors in the insula changed from insula to domus. Now, in the insula, you had this connector here, which I called K1, of course, completely arbitrary. But if you remember, there was the Decumanus Maximus here, and there was another road here at the back. And at the time of the 2nd century, here there was this long corridor. And this long corridor was not only used by those who lived in the insula to access the upper floors or to access the ground floor apartment, but it was also used by passers-by to actually go from one road to another road without having to go around the whole of the building. This is a situation that we find also at Ostia in other buildings. An example, you can see it on the right-hand side. That is the Insula degli Aurighi. Now, so this is what happens in the 2nd century AD. But when then you go onto the late antique domus, then the situation changes completely. Because, of course, the proprietor buys the whole of the structure. So he dismantles this whole corridor. And here he builds these 2 rooms, B and C. But then at the same time, at the moment in which you actually dismantle the main connector between the various parts of the house, then you have to build something else to replace it. And so in the late antique domus, we have 2 connectors. One is R, and the other one is 8E. And these 2 then are 2 corridors, but couldn't be more different. This is corridor R, and you would say, well, hang on a minute, you said the corridor R was a medianum. Yes, it was in the 2nd century, so it was a living unit. Now it is no more a living unit, this one here. Now it's not a place where you would stay. It is a place where you would move, and actually this becomes the main connector on this side of the house because it gives access to E. It gives access, you see, they create all this series of openings. It gives access to the room where there is the Ninfeo. And then when you look, of course, from here, then you would go also to this other room. And then it gives access to all the other rooms on its southern side. So this is this becomes a place for circulation, and this is R. But then look at corridor AD. This is really something quite sort of strange. Let's look at the shape. The width of corridor AD here is something like 1.77 meters. Then here, at this level, it shrinks to just slightly more than a meter. And then here, at the entrance to Courtier D, it shrinks even more at 90 centimeters. You'd say, well, how this is possible? Well, it is possible because this wall is not even parallel to this wall, probably as a result of a poor layout, but certainly is also very convenient. It's a very convenient situation. If we had had a corridor like this, then nothing would have actually stopped a tunnel view from this room into here, but actually shrinking it more and more, and shrinking it as much as possible without detriment to the internal traffic. Here, the corridor had to have a certain width because there was quite a lot of from here to part of the upper floors to part here. But shrinking it more and more and more actually meant that a view from here to here was as much as possible narrowed and prevented. And I can tell you that they did all that they could to actually prevent people from seeing this corridor, because they even built a wall in here. And the wall, I haven't represented it because it's only known from archival sources, but a wall was here. So this corridor was actually invisible. Look at what it looks like. It's really very, very small. This is corridor AD, and this is corridor A. Look just at the difference, even in width, between the two. And this is from this archival picture. This is, let's say, the access to this corridor AD from Courtier D. Why concealing it? Why taking all this space? Oh, but because the corridor leads to the service area. So the area where the slaves lived and where the slaves worked. And to judge from the size of the working area, from the water provisions, from the size of the apartment that they occupied, this master must have had a number of slaves. So I would like to wrap it up to say that the main subtext of late antique domestic architecture, or at least some of the late antique domestic architecture, is the social relationship and relationship between the master and his extended families, especially the slaves, the master and his clients, because probably this was the area that was reserved to them, two antechambers that could be accessed directly from the Decumanus Maximus. And then the master and his peers, his very distinguished guests, who did not need to get into the house from the Decumanus Maximus and actually mingle with all the others. They would have their own access from the side, and actually they would have access to the most distinguished part of the house without intruding in anybody else's world. So the Domus del Ninfeo at the very end was structured so that the dominus had a complete power to regulate the degree of familiarity wanted to establish with the outsiders. And to better fulfill this aim, several late antique houses, not only this, but several others, actually introduced a duplication of spaces. And in the Domus del Ninfeo, all main spaces are duplicated or multiplied. You have two antechambers here. You have a number of dining rooms, C, U, and E here. You have a number of meeting rooms, S, T, and B up here. And of course, also this courtyard D, if you wanted, could serve as an additional, particularly pleasing meeting place. And so my concluding comment is that the owner of this house did not spare expense to have a house that was the embodiment of, in bricks and mortar, of the world he lived and he believed in. Different people of different status could actually work and be welcome here, but as long as the separation between all these classes was clearly maintained. And this is, in summary, a structure that calls for, not for inclusion, but for separation. And with this final thought, I would like to end up my presentation about the Domus del Ninfeo, and I would like to thank you all very, very much for your attention. Thank you.